Welcome back to Dead Good Book Reviews. I'm Judith and you're watching another episode of Overbooked, the series where I talk about every single book on my shelf because I did it 3 times in a row and that means I have magical powers now. Today we are talking about Naomi Novik's Spinning Silver. As with last week's video where I talked about Uprooted, I haven't made any preparations for this. I don't really know how it's going to go. I don't know how long I'm going to talk for. We'll see how we go. I did do a quick cheeky reread of Spinning Silver back in the summer. That's a nice catch-all because I can't remember anything that happens to me ever. So it's relatively fresh in my mind because I haven't read this as many times as I've read Uprooted. Some quick disclaimers before we start. My acquisition, that's what I'm looking for, of this book was somewhat convoluted because technically it was free from a pub... Oh, there's a spider on the ceiling. It's not bothering me. I'm not going to bother you, sir. You hang out up there. I'll do you later. So yes, technically it came from a publisher, but via Justine, who was sent 2 copies and kindly sent this to me I think before we'd ever actually met in person. Just general kind good vibes to Justine. If you're not following her on TikTok, you should be. To the point where this still has the press release in, which was helpful because I can tell you that it originally came out in July 2018. So it's getting on a little bit now. So yes, technically from a publisher, sort of, regardless of where books come from, nobody's paying me to talk about books and all opinions are my own. I'm also going to keep this as spoiler-free as humanly possible. If you do want to go into this book knowing absolutely nothing, click away now. As always, I'll also link the story graph for the book down below in case you want to check out any user-generated content warnings. We talked about Naomi Novik last week. She's written a whole host of things. Most recently published is The Golden Enclaves, which is the 3rd book in the Scholarmance series. I have yet to read it at the time of filming this. I am picking up my copy tomorrow afternoon, and I'm very excited to get down to business. But yes, 2018 marked the release of Spinning Silver, which got people like me incredibly excited because Uprooted came out in 2016, I think, 2015? 15 sounds about right. I know I reviewed it last week, but for me that was many weeks ago. That original fairy tale was something we hadn't seen from Naomi Novik since then. They announced Spinning Silver and I immediately was very hyped. I knew I was going to want to read it. I was very excited to obtain a slightly early copy and I read it and I had a great time, and then I sort of forgot about it for several years until making this video and I went, I should do a reread. So I did. Yes, if you want to find out more about Naomi Novik, I'll link her website. I also really enjoyed the Temeraire series. I'm still working on finishing that before I make a video for it. I'm going to read you the plot for this because it's a little bit convoluted. Miriam is the daughter and granddaughter of moneylenders, but her father's too kind-hearted to collect his debts. They face poverty until Miriam hardens her own heart and takes up his work in their village. Her success creates rumours she can turn silver into gold, which attracts the fairy king of winter himself. He sets her an impossible challenge, and if she fails, she'll die. Yet, if she triumphs, it may mean a fate worse than death, and in her desperate efforts to succeed, Miriam unwittingly spins a web that draws in the unhappy daughter of a lord. Irina's father schemes to wed her to the Tsar. He will pay any price to achieve this goal. However, the dashing Tsar is not what he seems, and the secret he hides threatens to consume the lands of mortals and winter alike. Torn between deadly choices, Miriam and Irina embark on a quest that will take them to the limits of sacrifice, power, and love. In this fairy tale-inspired novel, Naomi Novik weaves a rich, multi-layered tapestry that is a joy to read. Would we agree? Let me tell you. I'm going to start with the kind of thing that I think is the broadest thing I can say about this, and that's that I don't like this as much as Uprooted, and I can't necessarily pin down why, which makes me feel like it's a much more personal preference kind of thing. I think that Uprooted, I just got on with the characters a bit more. That being said, I really like Miriam as a character. I think that she's someone who you can completely understand why she's doing what she's doing, which I always appreciate, and she's also a character who takes on quite a lot, which is something that I can relate to personally. And I think that the journey she has right at the start of the book, so facing poverty, saving her family, dealing with the moral implications of the stuff that she's getting into, and then dealing with the Starrick, which they use fairy in the blurb, but they're called the Starrick in the book, so imagine fae elves kind of thing. Dealing with that whole situation, I think she's very strong, and she doesn't show a lot of vulnerability except for moments where it really counts, and it makes for a really interesting character read. Irina, the Tsar's daughter, she was okay as a plotline. I wasn't super fussed about that side of the book. I was much more interested in Miriam's story and in... I'm going to remember the character's name, because there's another character they don't mention. Wanda. There we go. So yes, Wanda is hired by Miriam to escape her father, and she's sort of another plotline, and I'm not really sure why they didn't put her into the blurb, but okay, fine. We kind of have this interweaving story of three women and some other characters that get brought in at various points, and kind of the world is not at stake, but parts of the world are, and a lot of magical stuff is happening, and a lot of mundane stuff is happening, and it's interesting. Fairy tale inspired is definitely the right word. A lot of people dubbed this a Rumpelstiltskin retelling really early on. It's not, and yet it is. It has a lot of beats of that story that are very familiar, but it's not a direct I was going to say a direct rip, but that's not what I mean. A direct take on Rumpelstiltskin. The other thing I think it would be remiss not to mention is the Jewish representation. I will correct myself in the edit, but I believe Naomi Novik is Jewish. I think. But I felt it really interesting to explore that character, especially through this lens of moneylending, which is obviously... I'm not the right person, nor do I have the space to get into like why that is historically significant, but it is, and I thought it was fascinating, and I really liked that aspect of the book included, and the idea of how do you deal with, so for example, if you're in another world that you can't necessarily track days, when is the Sabbath, how do you deal with that? And I thought that was really interesting. I've seen other books do similar things. This was the first one that I read that really did that. I also thought that the whole plotline with the Starret King and that thing, which could be a questionable plotline because she is kind of kidnapped-ish. She's not. I think it's handled really well, personally. I think if you don't love the romance in Uprooted, you won't love the romance. Romance in huge inverted commas, it's complicated in this. You might not love it. I think for me, one of the strongest aspects of this book is the way that the magic follows fairy tale rules. I just think it's so clever. It's what I always talk about when I bring up this book. And I did actually mark the page when I read it because I wanted to talk about it again. So this is page 106. So we're far enough in if you really don't want to hear a section of the book. It's fine. Wait, I said as he began to turn away. Why would you take me? You must know I have no magic. No, not really. I can't change silver to gold for you in your kingdom if you take me away. Of course you can, mortal girl, he said over his shoulder, as if I was the one being a fool. A power claimed and challenged and thrice carried out is true. The proving makes it so. And I just loved that idea of Miriam accomplishes a task 3 times through non-magical means, and yet it gives magic because that's the rule, is you've done it 3 times. And that's such a cool fairy tale tidbit. I really like that. And there's some elements in Irina's story that I thought also followed similar rules to that, and it's very cool. My biggest qualm with this book is such a small one, and it's so, in some ways so silly, and in some ways just really indicative of who I am as a reader. The chapter perspectives change. They're first person almost always, I'm pretty sure. Don't quote me on that. Some of it is first person. And the perspectives change within the chapter, so we visit multiple characters in one chapter. However, you don't really get an indication of who you have moved to, so you have to infer it from the context clues, and yes, on the one hand, it's quite obvious because you're following the plotline of one person, but as someone who finds it very difficult to shift perspective very suddenly without that chapter break, I just found it really hard to stay afloat in this book, especially when more characters get introduced. I was getting a little bit overwhelmed, and I just think adding even just a little icon that would tell you whose chapter you're going into would work really well. I don't know if it does in some versions, it doesn't in mine, which is the UK Macmillan one. Wasn't everything I wanted from that perspective. I needed a little bit more help than it was willing to give me. I also just think that overall as a story, because of all these different perspectives that are going on, it's much less streamlined than Uprooted is, and as such it doesn't stay with me as much. I get a little bit more muddled because there's more happening. Like, I very much remember Miriam's story, and everyone else's stories get a little bit hodgepodged in there, and I don't know if that's because I've read it fewer times than I've read Uprooted. Entirely plausible. Just for me, it didn't stick as well. Still a book I would reread in the future though, so there's that. And maybe if in a couple of rereads time, across a couple of winters, I would feel very differently about it. And I'd be like, no, I remember all that happens to Irina and she's my favourite. I don't know. I just think it's really interesting how they're marketing it on 2 heroines, and I definitely read it as having 3. How interesting. Marketing is fascinating, isn't it? Comparisons, other things you might want to read. Catherine Arden is a really obvious one. The Winter Night trilogy definitely fits with a lot of the themes of this book. I think it's very much a case of if you like one, you'll like the other. Often comparisons to the Winter Night trilogy do not hold up. In this, I think they do for the most part. The Winter Night trilogy is a little bit more action-y, I think, overall. Not the first book, but the later books. Basically, all the books that get compared to Winter Night are good examples of other books you might want to read if you've read this. It's a hard example to go. If you do want to read Naomi Novik, I really recommend Uprooted if you've not read it already. That's the best comparison to this. In terms of other original fairy tale kind of stuff, I have a hard time recommending this kind of thing, despite the fact that it's one of my favourite things to read. I don't see it near me, so I don't know. Oh, I wonder about something like Blanca y Roja for magic in the everyday and multiple heroines doing stuff. Maybe the Anna Marie McLemore, that might be a good shout. They're fairy tale inspired stuff. It's a lot more YA than this is, but it's still enjoyable and I would recommend it. I will also say before I close off this video that I think a lot of this is because a lot of this is drawing from both Rumpelstiltskin and Polish-inspired stories that Naomi Novik grew up hearing. I do not know all of those stories, so it's possible that I'm missing and Irina is actually a beloved character from folklore. I don't know, and if you do know, please do let me know, because I would love to read them. I really like finding stories that inspired other stories and going like, oh, that makes so much more sense now. I like putting the pieces together, but I can only read what I've read, and I can only reference what I've read, and this is what I've read. Great. Well, have you read this? Do you have plans to? Have you read this and Uprooted? Do you have a favourite of the two? I would really love to know. Are there any other fairy tales or original fairy tales, fairy tale inspired kind of fiction that you really love? I would love to know. Do we just reread the Winter Night trilogy again? Because I really kind of want to, having talked about this a little bit. That's what I want to pick up next. But I do have 15 books to read this week, so maybe not. Let me know all of those things down in the comments below. While you're down there commenting, if you haven't already, please do subscribe. It really does make me feel loved and appreciated, though nothing makes me feel more loved and appreciated than my patrons over on Patreon, who support the channel and make videos like this possible. They also get early access to videos and bonus content. If you're interested in joining their number, that's linked below, as is my Twitter and my Discord, if you want to come have chill chats about books. Thank you so much for watching. That's all from me, and I will see you in the next one.
There's gonna be some bloopers now.
Let's pop you just there, in front of the gap in the shelf where it came from. Sorry, we just have to take the dog to the vet. She's just getting a regular checkup, so there may be some noises in the background. I apologise.